By 1865, the Saints had been in Utah for nearly 20 years. Brigham Young was no longer leading a desperate refugee people. He was an aging leader presiding over an established territory filled with farms, towns, roads, and expanding settlements. The Civil War had just ended, federal attention was turning back to the West, and pressure on native lands was intensifying. Among Utah's native tribes, especially the Ute people, desperation was growing. What followed became known as the Black Hawk War, the longest and most destructive conflict between Mormon settlers and native peoples in Utah history. The war is named after Antonga Black Hawk, a Ute leader born around 1828. Church history sources describe him not as a random aggressor, but as a man responding to crisis. Ute communities were losing traditional hunting grounds, facing broken promises from territorial officials, and suffering severe food shortages as settler expansion accelerated. By the early 1860s, starvation was a real and immediate threat. In April 1865, violence erupted. Raids began across central and southern Utah, targeting livestock, supply routes, and isolated settlements. These attacks were met with retaliation, and the conflict quickly spread. At the time, Brigham Young remained president of the church and the dominant political authority in Utah. He had long promoted a policy he summarized as feed them rather than fight them. Sermons and territorial correspondence from the period show Young repeatedly urging settlers to provide food when possible, avoid revenge attacks, and prevent unnecessary bloodshed. Modern church publications often emphasize this peace-oriented policy. However, policy and reality did not align. Despite these instructions, violence continued to escalate. From 1865 to 1872, Utah experienced hundreds of raids, dozens of settler deaths, and an unknown but likely higher number of native casualties. Church history library records confirm repeated mobilization of territorial militias, the fortification of settlements, and the abandonment of entire regions during periods of intense fighting. By 1866, the conflict had expanded across much of the territory. Militia reports, settler diaries, and territorial documents all describe sustained fear, hunger, and loss. While Young continued to preach restraint, the war persisted, driven largely by local retaliation, desperation, and the breakdown of centralized control. A significant turning point came in 1869 when Brigham Young was removed as territorial governor. Federal officials began taking a more direct role in Indian affairs and military enforcement. Church and territorial records show increased federal troop presence, more formal negotiations, and growing pressure on native groups to relocate to reservations. By 1872, the Black Hawk War effectively ended, but the consequences were lasting. Church histories acknowledge that the conflict resulted in the highest death toll of any native war in Utah. Widespread displacement, accelerated reservation confinement, and the permanent loss of native autonomy. For settlers, the war hardened attitudes and reinforced fear. For native peoples, it marked the collapse of organized resistance. This is where the historical tension becomes unavoidable. Brigham Young preached peace, authorized aid, and discouraged revenge. Yet under his leadership, the most destructive native conflict in Utah history unfolded. Not because he sought war, but because he governed a system where expansion continued, food promises failed, and local violence outpaced central authority. So the question history leaves us with is this: if a leader promotes peace but presides over years of violence, how should responsibility be measured? By intent, by policy, or by outcome? And when faith, government, and survival collide, who ultimately pays the price?